What happens when a young toolmaker from Ohio decides the Marine Corps doesn't have the weapon it really needs? The answer doesn't lie in a machine shop, and it doesn't lie in a Pentagon briefing room. It lies on a beach black as coal, where every meter of sand can kill you, where death comes so fast you don't always hear the shot that takes your life. It lies in the calloused hands of a 23-year-old who understands the tremor of metal, the rhythm of gears, the breaking point of steel, more clearly than he understands his own feelings. And it begins with a crazy idea, the kind any officer would shake his head at. If we don't have the right weapon, then we build it ourselves. No one believed it would work. No one thought a young tradesman, fresh out of Dayton and newly dressed in Marine Corps uniform, could create anything that would change the course of a battle, until his invention saved an entire battalion. This is the story of Tony Stein, a tool and die maker from Ohio, a Marine who refused to bow his head, a man who believed that in war, good enough is the fastest way to die. And before we talk about the weapon he built from scraps of metal others had thrown away, we have to understand the terrifying problem that brought it into existence. If you want to hear war stories from a different angle, slower, more reflective, and deeper, follow Beyond History. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and you won't miss any of the journeys we're about to take together. February 1945. Iwo Jima, a tiny 8-square-mile island in the middle of the Pacific, covered in black volcanic sand and blood. Beneath the surface, 11 miles of tunnels. Inside those tunnels, 17,000 Japanese soldiers who had spent months turning every inch of ground into a death trap. Standing before all of that were the United States Marines, armed with the M1919 Browning machine gun, their standard weapon for fire support. 31 pounds empty. 400 rounds per minute. Effective for defense. Excellent when you'd already set up position and didn't need to move. But for an assault, for infantrymen who needed to advance quickly across a flat beach while everything around them exploded, completely unsuited. Tony Stein had known this for months. November 1944, Camp Tarawa, Hawaii. Stein stood watching a training exercise. Machine gunners were trying to keep up with advancing rifle squads. They fired. They stopped. They broke down the gun. They carried it forward. They set it up again. And in that time, 3, maybe 4 minutes, the rifle squad had advanced 100 yards without any covering fire. The momentum died. Stein watched the gunners struggle with the weight. The math didn't work. 31 pounds without ammunition. Add the tripod, add the ammo box, and you're asking 2 men to haul 70 pounds through sand while staying combat ready. The numbers didn't add up. The speed didn't add up. The entire system didn't add up. And then Sergeant Mel Grevich found him. Grevich wasn't a talker. He was the kind of man who acted first, explained later, if you were lucky. And one afternoon in November, after a training exercise ended, Grevich found Stein in the maintenance shed. The exact words exchanged between Grevich and Stein weren't recorded, but based on what happened next, the conversation likely went something like this. "I got something you need to see." Stein looked up from his work. "What is it?" What we know for certain is that Grevich showed Stein an ANM-2 aircraft machine gun he'd salvaged from a crashed Douglas SBD Dauntless at Bougainville. Stein picked it up. 21 pounds. 10 pounds lighter than the M1919. He could feel its balance, its potential. "What's the rate of fire?" 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. Stein looked at Grevich. 3 times faster than the M1919. "Right. And what's the problem?" Grevich pointed to the spade grips at the rear, designed to mount on aircraft, not for a single Marine to carry. No stock, no sights, no way for one man to carry it and fire accurately while advancing. Stein was quiet for a minute. His fingers ran along the barrel, feeling the metal, feeling the weight, feeling the possibility. "Give me 2 weeks," he finally said. What happened next wasn't the work of an engineer. It was the work of a craftsman, someone who understood machines not through books, but through feel. Tony Stein was born in Dayton, Ohio, in 1922. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Austria who had fled anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe to find a better life in America. And they found it, but not easily. Tony's father worked in a factory. His mother did housework for other families. Tony grew up knowing that nothing was given to you. Everything had to be earned. As a teenager, Tony worked as a lathe operator at Patterson Field, then as a tool and die maker at Delco Products. The work demanded precision down to the 1,000th of an inch. You couldn't make mistakes. You couldn't guess. You had to understand metal, how it bent, how it handled stress, how it responded to heat. Now, in the maintenance shed at Camp Tarawa, Tony applied all that knowledge to a problem nobody else thought could be solved. He started with the stock. The M1 Garand rifle had a solid walnut stock. Good wood. He hollowed it out to accept the machine gun's buffer tube, working slowly with a hand drill and chisel. No machines, no blueprints, just feel. The trigger mechanism was the hardest part. Aircraft guns used electrical firing. Infantry couldn't carry batteries into combat. He needed something mechanical, something that wouldn't fail. Stein fabricated a solenoid-style trigger mechanism from scrap sheet metal. He bent the metal by hand, welded each small piece, tested, adjusted, tested again. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. He went back, did it again. Grevich welded a Browning automatic rifle, BAR bipod, to the front. Stein added bar rear sights so it could be aimed. They worked through the night, when everyone else was sleeping, when the camp was quiet, and only the sound of cicadas came from outside. And then, after 2 weeks, they had a complete weapon. 25 pounds, 100-round ammunition box. Could empty that box in 5 seconds of continuous fire. They called it the Stinger. Not everyone thought it was a good idea. One sergeant looked at the weapon and said, "That thing's gonna jam on the first burst." Another said, "Barrel's too thin. It'll melt." A platoon commander from 2nd Battalion looked at Stein and said, "Only an idiot would carry a plain gun into an infantry fight." But Stein didn't argue. He just asked to test it. They went to the firing range one morning in late November. The sun was out. A light wind blew from the ocean. Some Marines gathered to watch, some curious, some skeptical. Stein set up a target at 200 yards, loaded the 100-round box, brought the Stinger to his shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The sound wasn't like anything on a Marine firing range, not like a rifle, not like a standard machine gun. It sounded like metal tearing through metal. 1,200 rounds per minute created a kind of continuous roar, almost impossible to distinguish individual shots. It was just a wave of pure sound. Stein held the trigger for 6 seconds. When he released it, the ammo box was empty. 100 rounds were gone, and the target at 200 yards was shredded. Nobody talked about idiots after that. The company commander approved the Stinger. The battalion commander approved it. Stein was asked to build more. He made 6 total, 1 for each of Company A's 3 rifle platoons, 1 for the demolition section, 1 for Grevich, and 1 for himself. The Stinger was going to war. But nobody, not even Stein, knew what it would have to endure. Morning of February 19th, 1945. 9 o'clock. Tony Stein crouched behind a shallow depression in the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, gripping the Stinger, the weapon that 3 months earlier his sergeant had called a stupid idea. Around him, men from Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines were pinned down. Machine gun fire from camouflaged pillboxes, mortar rounds falling. Men dying on the terraces. The 5th Marine Division had already taken 43 casualties by mid-morning. The beach was supposed to be the easy part. But nothing was easy on Iwo Jima. The problem wasn't courage. The Marines had plenty of courage, The problem was they couldn't see the enemy. The pillboxes were too well camouflaged, built into volcanic rock formations covered with black sand, with firing slits only inches wide. From 50 yards away you couldn't see them until they shot at you. Tanks had been called up for support, but they were stuck in the volcanic sand. The massive treads of the M4 Sherman tanks sank deep into the loose ash, spinning uselessly. Some had thrown their tracks entirely. Naval gunfire support couldn't hit targets they couldn't see. And so Marines lay on the sand, pinned down, while Japanese fire cut through them like a knife through butter. Tony Stein looked around. A private first class lay 10 feet to his left, not moving. A corporal was clutching his leg, blood running through his fingers. A sergeant was yelling into a radio, calling for reinforcements, but no reinforcements were coming. And then Stein made a decision. If they couldn't see the enemy positions, he would make them visible. He stood up. This wasn't courage, not in the way most people think about it. This was mathematics. Japanese pillboxes were designed to fire at people lying down or running low. Their firing angles were calculated for that, but a man standing fully upright, not moving, just standing there, created a target unusual enough to make the gunners react. And when they reacted, they fired. And when they fired, they revealed their position. Stein stood straight up in the middle of a crossfire. Bullets snapped past his head. He could hear them, small, sharp whistles, like insects flying fast. One round passed so close to his right ear that he felt the air displaced. A mortar round exploded 20 yards behind him, throwing black sand and shrapnel into the air. But now he could see it. 75 yards northwest. A pillbox camouflaged with volcanic rock and sand. The barrel of a Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun protruding just inches. Stein lowered the stinger, aimed, squeezed the solenoid trigger. The weapon roared to life at 1,200 rounds per minute. It didn't sound like anything else on the battlefield. It wasn't the single sound of gunfire. It was a continuous wave of metal hitting metal, a strange, deep roar that seemed to vibrate the air around it. The pillbox disintegrated. 1,200 rounds per minute hammered the volcanic rock and sandbags. Concrete crumbled, metal warped, and the Type 92 machine gun fell silent. Through the dust and smoke, Stein could see movement inside the position. Then nothing. He shifted his aim to a second pillbox 40 yards to the left. Another burst. 5 seconds of continuous fire. The concrete structure absorbed some rounds, but the volume of fire was overwhelming. The Japanese machine gun crew inside stopped shooting. Around Stein, Marines began to move. Seeing the enemy positions suppressed, riflemen advanced from their shallow depressions in the sand. Sergeants shouted orders. The assault was moving again. Stein charged the first pillbox. The Stinger was lighter than the standard M1919, and he could run with it. He reached the position in seconds. Inside, 3 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The 1,200 rounds per minute rate of fire had simply cut through everything. He moved to the second pillbox. Same result, 2 enemy soldiers down, position destroyed. But then Stein felt the Stinger go light in his hands. The ammo box was empty. 100 rounds gone in less than 10 seconds of actual trigger time. Stein had anticipated this problem during training in Hawaii, but experiencing it in combat was different. The Stinger was devastating. It was also impossibly hungry. He looked back toward the beach. 200 yards. The ammunition resupply point was near the waterline, where landing craft was still unloading supplies under sporadic mortar fire from Japanese positions on the mountain. He would have to cross open ground completely exposed to get more linked .30 caliber ammunition. He started running. The volcanic sand made every step difficult. It wasn't like regular sand. The ash was loose, terraced, and gave way underfoot. Marines called it running through ball bearings. Stein's boots sank 3 inches with each stride. Halfway to the beach, he passed a wounded Marine, a private first class from 2nd Battalion. Shrapnel wound to the left leg. The man was conscious but couldn't walk. Stein stopped. He looked down toward the beach. Then he looked back at the Marine. The math was simple. This Marine dies if nobody carries him. Nobody else was running toward the beach, so it had to be him. Stein grabbed him, slung him over his shoulder, and kept running. The Marine weighed 160 pounds. The Stinger weighed 25 pounds. Stein's combat pack added another 30 pounds. He was carrying over 215 pounds through volcanic ash, while Japanese mortars bracketed the beach. He didn't think about the weight. He thought about time, about distance, about whether this Marine lived or died depending on how fast he could run. He reached the supply point at 9:45 a.m. A corpsman took the wounded Marine. Stein grabbed 4 ammo boxes, each containing 100 rounds of linked .30 caliber. He stuffed 2 boxes into his pack, carried 1 in each hand, and turned back toward his platoon's position. The return trip took 3 minutes. Japanese snipers had started targeting Marines moving between the beach and forward positions. Bullets kicked up black ash around Stein's boots. A mortar round detonated 30 yards to his right, throwing volcanic rock and shrapnel. He didn't stop. When he reached Company A's position, his platoon sergeant pointed to a 3rd pillbox. This one was larger, reinforced concrete with a Type 96 light machine gun covering the approach to the airfield. 2 previous assaults had failed. 4 Marines lay dead in front of it. Stein loaded a fresh ammo box into the Stinger. He checked the belt feed. The weapon was already hot from the previous engagement, but the thin aircraft barrel could handle more. He stood up and advanced on the pillbox alone. The Type 96 opened fire immediately. Rounds snapped past Stein's head and chest. He kept walking forward, the Stinger at his shoulder. At 50 yards, he opened fire. The weapon's rate of fire was so high that the Japanese gunner couldn't adjust his aim fast enough. Stein's rounds found the firing slit. The enemy gun went silent. He charged the final 20 yards and dropped a grenade through the opening. The explosion killed the 3-man crew inside. Stein turned back to reload. The ammo box was empty again. Over the next 6 hours, Tony Stein established a pattern that would later become legendary in Marine Corps history. Fire until out of ammunition. Run to the beach. Find a wounded Marine. Carry him to the aid station. Get ammunition. Run back. Repeat. 8 times. On the 2nd trip, he found a Marine with a sucking chest wound. The kind of injury where you have 15 minutes, maybe 20 if you're lucky, before bleeding out. Stein carried him. Ran. The corpsman said later that if Stein had been 30 seconds slower, that Marine would have died. On the 3rd and 4th trips, he encountered 2 wounded men at the same time. One had shrapnel in his abdomen. One had lost part of his right hand. Stein couldn't carry both. He carried the more critically wounded man down first, ran back for ammunition, then made a separate trip to get the 2nd man. By 10:30 a.m., Stein had completed 4 trips to the beach and back. He had carried 4 wounded Marines to safety. He had brought back 400 rounds of ammunition, and his platoon had advanced 200 yards inland from the beach. But the Stinger was suffering. The barrel was discolored from heat. The solenoid trigger mechanism was starting to stick. And Stein's boots were disintegrating from the volcanic ash and constant running. He looked down at his feet. The soles were nearly gone. The leather was cracked and torn. Running in them was becoming painful. Each step sent sharp pains through the arches of his feet. Stein made a decision. He unlaced his boots and kicked them off, barefoot, on volcanic ash. The decision seemed insane, but Stein understood the mathematics behind it. Every second mattered. His boots were adding friction and slowing him down. The ash was abrasive, but not unbearably hot in the shaded areas. He could run faster without them. He also removed his helmet. The M1 steel pot weighed 2.5 pounds. Added to the boots, he was shedding nearly 5 pounds of equipment. 5 pounds that would let him move faster between the beach and his platoon. His fifth run to the beach took 2 minutes 40 seconds. Barefoot, he could actually gain traction in the loose volcanic sand. His feet sank into the ash, but without the rigid boot soles, he could feel the terrain and adjust his stride. It must have hurt. The ash was coarse, abrasive, like running on broken glass. But it was faster. He grabbed another wounded Marine on the way down, shrapnel to the abdomen. The man was unconscious. Stein carried him over his shoulder, delivered him to the corpsman, loaded up on ammunition, and ran back to Company A's position. By 11 a.m., Stein had made 6 trips to the beach. He had carried 6 wounded Marines to safety. He had brought back 600 rounds of ammunition, and his platoon had advanced 300 yards from the beach. They were approaching the first airfield, but Japanese resistance was intensifying. The Japanese had constructed a defensive network of pillboxes, spider holes, and underground bunkers connected by tunnels. When one position was destroyed, soldiers would emerge from another location and resume firing. The Stinger was the only weapon in Company A that could deliver enough volume of fire to keep multiple positions suppressed simultaneously. When Stein opened up on one pillbox, the sheer sound of 1,200 rounds per minute was enough to make adjacent positions hesitate. That hesitation gave riflemen time to advance and throw grenades. Despite the mechanical issues, the Stinger remained effective. At 11:20 a.m., Stein's platoon encountered a reinforced Japanese position that had stopped the advance of 2 other companies. It was a concrete bunker with 3 firing slits positioned to cover the approach to airfield number 1. Multiple Type 96 light machine guns inside, interlocking fields of fire. 2 tank destroyers had tried to knock it out. Both were hit by concealed 47mm anti-tank guns and withdrew. An airstrike was called in, but the bombs missed by 50 yards. The bunker remained operational. Stein studied the position. The firing slits were narrow, maybe 8 inches wide and 4 inches tall. Difficult targets. But the Stinger's rate of fire meant that if he aimed at a slit and held the trigger, statistically some rounds would get through. He advanced alone. 50 yards from the bunker, he went prone and opened fire. The Stinger emptied its 100-round box in 7 seconds. At that range, at least 30 rounds went through the firing slits. The Japanese guns inside went silent. Stein reloaded and charged the bunker. He dropped grenades through the slits. The explosions killed the 5-man crew inside. Company A's advance resumed. His 7th trip to the beach came at 11:50 a.m. This time he carried a Marine who had lost both legs below the knees to a mine. The man was still conscious, screaming. Stein ran the entire 200 yards while the Marine bled into his uniform. The corpsman said later that if Stein had been 30 seconds slower, the Marine would have died from blood loss. On the return trip, Stein encountered something unexpected. A round snapped past his head, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. He dropped flat. Someone had moved into position overlooking the supply route. The angle of the shot told him, ridge line, 200 yards east, spider hole or rock formation. The sniper fired again, missed by inches. Stein lay motionless. He would have controlled his breathing. The sniper would be watching for movement. Any movement. Another round cracked overhead. The sniper was firing at where Stein had been, not where he was. That meant the shooter hadn't acquired his exact location yet. Stein had maybe 10 seconds before they adjusted. He rolled left, grabbed the Stinger, and came up running. Not running away. Running toward. Running perpendicular to the sniper's line of sight would make him a harder target than running in a straight line. And if he could close the distance, the Stinger's rate of fire would overwhelm any bolt-action rifle. 3 more shots, all misses. Stein was sprinting now, barefoot through volcanic ash, the Stinger in his hands, ammo boxes bouncing in his pack. At 150 yards, he saw movement, a figure in a spider hole, partially concealed by volcanic rock. Stein dropped to one knee and opened fire. The Stinger roared. 1,200 rounds per minute shredded the rock and surrounding terrain. The sniper's position disintegrated. When the ammo box ran empty, there was no return fire. Stein reloaded and approached the position carefully. The sniper was dead. A Type 97 rifle lay beside him. Stein took the rifle's telescopic sight and continued toward Company A. When he reached his platoon at 1 p.m., the situation had deteriorated. Company A was pinned down by a fortification complex that included at least 8 pillboxes arranged in a semicircle, interlocking fields of fire. Any Marine who stood up was immediately engaged from multiple positions. The company had taken 12 casualties in the past 20 minutes trying to advance. The company commander had called for tank support, but the M4 Shermans were still bogged down near the beach. The volcanic ash was too soft. The tanks kept throwing tracks or getting stuck. Artillery support was limited because forward observers couldn't get clear lines of sight to enemy positions. Stein moved to the forwardmost position and assessed the situation. The 8 pillboxes formed an arc about 100 yards ahead. Japanese soldiers were also moving through trenches connecting the positions. It wasn't just static defense, it was a coordinated system. The Stinger's advantage was volume of fire. Stein calculated that if he could suppress multiple positions simultaneously, riflemen could advance under that suppression, but it would require exposing himself again. He stood up and opened fire on the leftmost pillbox. 5-second burst, 100 rounds. The position went silent. He shifted aim to the next pillbox. Another burst. Silence. He was methodically working his way across the arc, suppressing each position in sequence. Japanese soldiers in the trenches began firing at him. Type 99 rifles, Type 96 light machine guns. Rounds kicked up ash around his feet. One bullet struck the Stinger's barrel with a metallic clang. The weapon kept firing. Stein emptied his ammo box and dropped flat to reload. While he reloaded, riflemen from Company A advanced 50 yards. When Stein stood up and resumed firing, they advanced another 50 yards. The coordination was instinctive. No orders needed. The Marines understood that when the Stinger was firing, they could move. By 1:30 p.m., Company A had broken through the defensive arc. 5 of the 8 pillboxes were destroyed. The other 3 were abandoned. 17 Japanese soldiers were confirmed dead. Company A had lost 3 more Marines, but the advance continued. And Tony Stein, barefoot, bleeding, exhausted with a dying weapon in his hands, kept fighting. At 1:45 p.m., during the assault on the 6th pillbox, what Stein had feared most finally happened. He was firing a sustained burst when a Japanese Type 96 machine gun scored a direct hit. The impact was violent. The Stinger was ripped from Stein's hands and thrown 6 feet backward into the volcanic ash. No time to think. Only reflexes. Stein dove for cover behind a low rock ridge. Now he had no weapon. The Stinger lay in open ground between his position and the active enemy pillbox. The Japanese had seen it fall. They knew he was disarmed. They were waiting. Stein looked at the weapon lying in the ash. The barrel was smoking. He could see that the belt feed mechanism was damaged. Even if he retrieved it, the Stinger might not fire. But he had carried that weapon through 8 trips to the beach. He had used it to destroy more than 15 enemy positions. It had kept his platoon alive. He couldn't leave it. Stein prepared himself. Then he sprinted into the open. The Japanese machine gun opened fire immediately. Rounds snapped past his head and torso. Stein ran in a zigzag pattern, making himself a harder target. 3 seconds to reach the Stinger. He grabbed it, rolled behind another ridge, and checked the weapon. The belt was jammed. A round had struck the feed mechanism and bent the guide rails. Stein pulled out the damaged belt, cleared the jam with his fingers, and loaded a fresh ammo box. The belt fed correctly. He test-fired a 3-round burst. It worked. Stein stood up and emptied the entire box into the pillbox that had shot the Stinger from his hands. 100 rounds in 7 seconds. The position was obliterated. The Type 96 that had nearly killed him now fell silent permanently. Stein reloaded and continued the assault. By 2 p.m., Company A had pushed several hundred yards inland under relentless fire. Dozens of Japanese positions were being overrun or abandoned, many of them suppressed by Stein's Stinger as the platoon advanced. Exactly how many he personally neutralized was never recorded, but every Marine who fought beside him agreed that his firepower broke open multiple fortified points. His 8 barefoot runs to the beach brought ammunition forward and carried a wounded Marine back each time. 8 lives saved in the middle of the killing ground. And the Stinger, despite being shot, overheated, and mechanically abused, was still firing. But the weapon's condition was critical. The barrel was now visibly bent. The rate of fire had decreased to maybe 900 rounds per minute. The solenoid trigger mechanism was firing in bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, even when Stein wanted continuous fire, and the wooden stock was so charred that it was starting to crumble. Company A continued pressing forward through the afternoon. At 2:30 p.m., during an assault on a fortified trench system, the Stinger was hit again. This time, a Type 99 rifle round struck the receiver. The impact knocked the weapon from Stein's hands for the second time. It landed 10 feet away in a shell crater. Stein was now completely exposed. No cover, no weapon. Japanese soldiers in the trench were firing at him with rifles and grenades. He could see at least 6 enemy combatants. He ran for the Stinger. A grenade exploded 5 yards behind him, throwing volcanic ash and shrapnel. Fragments hit his left leg and back. Small wounds. Painful, but not incapacitating. He grabbed the Stinger and dove into the crater. The receiver had a deep gouge where the bullet had struck. Stein cycled the action manually. It was stiff but functional. He loaded a fresh belt, aimed at the trench, and fired. The Stinger worked. Barely. The rate of fire was down to maybe 600 rounds per minute, half its original capability. But 600 rounds per minute was still faster than anything else on the battlefield. Stein suppressed the trench while riflemen advanced with grenades. The position was cleared. 6 Japanese dead. Company A's advance continued. By 5 p.m., Company A had reached the base of Mount Suribachi. The 550-foot volcanic peak loomed above them. From there, Japanese observers could see every American position on the beach. Artillery spotters directed fire from the heights. The mountain had to be taken. But not today. Orders: establish defensive perimeter and hold overnight. The assault on Suribachi would begin tomorrow morning. For the first time in 8 hours, Stein had time to assess his own condition. His feet were torn and bleeding. Volcanic ash had worked its way into every cut, turning them into infected wounds. He had shrapnel fragments in his left calf and lower back from the grenade that afternoon. Minor wounds, but they needed treatment. His hands were blistered from carrying the hot Stinger, and he was exhausted. He had been in continuous combat for 8 hours. He had run approximately 3 miles total across those 8 trips to the beach, carrying wounded men, carrying ammunition, under fire, barefoot. The Stinger lay beside him in the fighting hole. The weapon was destroyed. The barrel needed replacement. The receiver was damaged. The stock was burned. The trigger mechanism was unreliable. But it had done its job. It had kept Company A moving forward when conventional weapons would have left them pinned on the beach. Other Marines started calling him the Barefoot Corporal. Some thought he was insane. Others called him the bravest man they'd ever seen. Stein didn't care about either assessment. He had done what needed doing. His platoon needed fire support. The Stinger provided it. Everything else was irrelevant. That night, while Stein tried to sleep in his fighting hole, Japanese infiltrators began probing Company A's perimeter. Small groups, 2 or 3 soldiers, testing the defenses, looking for weak points. Stein grabbed the stinger. Despite its damage, it still had one advantage: volume of fire. When a Japanese soldier appeared 30 yards from his position, Stein fired a burst. The weapon worked. The infiltrator died. By dawn on February 20th, Stein had been awake for 22 consecutive hours. The assault on Mount Suribachi began at 8 a.m. Company A, along with the rest of the 28th Marines, began climbing the volcanic slopes. The terrain was brutal: loose ash, no vegetation, exposed ridges where Japanese observers could see every movement. The enemy had fortified the mountain with over 60 pillboxes, bunkers, and cave positions. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Japanese soldiers had spent months preparing these defenses. They had stockpiled ammunition, food, and water inside the mountain's tunnel system. They intended to make the Americans pay for every yard. Stein carried the stinger up the mountain. An armorer had worked on it overnight, replacing the most damaged components. The barrel was still bent, but a new belt feed mechanism had been installed. The solenoid trigger was more reliable. The weapon would fire. But it was no longer the devastating tool it had been. At 9:30 a.m., Company A encountered a reinforced bunker complex halfway up the southern slope. 4 concrete bunkers connected by trenches. Multiple machine gun positions. Mortar crews firing from concealed pits. The 28th Marines' advance stalled. Stein moved forward with the stinger. He identified the primary bunker and opened fire. The damaged barrel meant the weapon's accuracy had decreased, but at close range, volume of fire still mattered. He suppressed the position long enough for demolition teams to move forward with satchel charges. The bunker was destroyed. Company A advanced another 50 yards. At 10:15 a.m., Stein's luck changed. A Japanese grenade landed 3 feet from his position. He saw it. He tried to move. The grenade detonated before he could get clear. Shrapnel hit his right arm, right leg, and torso. Multiple wounds. None immediately fatal, but he was bleeding heavily. Corpsmen reached him within minutes. They bandaged the wounds and called for evacuation. Stein refused. His platoon was still engaged. The stinger was still needed. He continued fighting. For the next 2 hours, Stein provided fire support while bleeding through his bandages. Every time a pillbox opened fire on advancing Marines, he suppressed it. Every time Japanese soldiers appeared in trench systems, he cut them down with sustained bursts. But by 12:30 p.m., Stein's wounds had worsened. He had lost significant blood. He was becoming lightheaded. His vision was narrowing. The corpsman told him he needed immediate evacuation, or he would die on this mountain. This time, Stein didn't argue. He handed the stinger to another Marine in his squad and allowed the corpsman to carry him down the mountain to the beach. From there, he was loaded onto a landing craft and transported to a hospital ship anchored offshore. On the hospital ship, doctors removed shrapnel from Stein's arm, leg, and torso. They treated him for blood loss and infection. They told him he would be sent to a rear area hospital in Hawaii, or possibly back to the United States. His war was over. On February 21st, while Stein recovered on the hospital ship, the 28th Marines continued their assault on Mount Suribachi. The fighting was savage. Every cave had to be cleared with flamethrowers and explosives. Every trench had to be taken in close combat. Japanese soldiers fought to the death rather than surrender. On February 23rd at 10:20 a.m., a patrol from Company E reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. They raised a small American flag. Photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment. Later that afternoon, a larger flag was raised. Rosenthal photographed that too. The image became the most iconic photograph of the Pacific War. Stein was not present for the flag raising. He was on the hospital ship, recovering. On February 25th, news reached the hospital ship that hit Stein harder than any grenade. The 5th Marine Division had moved north from Suribachi toward the center of the island. They were assaulting a position designated Hill 362A. The fighting was brutal. The 28th Marines were taking catastrophic casualties. Company A had lost 30% of its strength in 2 days. Stein's platoon sergeant was dead. His squad leader was dead. Marines he'd trained with in Hawaii were dying on a nameless hill in the center of Iwo Jima. On February 26th, against medical orders, Tony Stein left the hospital ship. He climbed down into a landing craft, returning to the beach, told the boat crew he'd been cleared to return to duty. He had not been cleared. He was AWOL from the hospital ship. But nobody stopped him. He reached the beach at 2 p.m., found a supply sergeant and requisitioned new boots. His feet were still bandaged, but he could walk. He grabbed an M1 Garand rifle from a supply dump. The Stinger was gone, either destroyed or being used by another Marine. It didn't matter. Stein was going back to his unit. He walked north across Iwo Jima, 6 miles, through volcanic ash and past destroyed Japanese positions, past burned-out tanks and scattered equipment, past graves registration teams collecting American dead. He reached Company A's position at Hill 362A on February 27th. The company had been reduced to 63 men from its original strength of 240. The survivors were exhausted. They had been fighting continuously for 8 days. No rest, no relief, just endless combat against an enemy that refused to surrender. Stein reported to the company commander. He was put back on the line immediately. Company A needed every rifle. For the next 2 days, Stein fought in the brutal close-quarters combat around Hill 362A. No Stinger, just an M1 Garand and grenades. The fighting was different without the improvised machine gun. Slower, more deliberate. But Stein was still effective. On March 1st, 1945, Company A was tasked with a reconnaissance patrol to locate a complex of Japanese pillboxes that had been harassing the regiment's advance. The patrol consisted of 19 Marines. Corporal Tony Stein was designated Assistant Patrol Leader. Their mission? Move forward approximately 400 yards, locate enemy positions, return with actionable intelligence. No assault, just reconnaissance. At 7 a.m. on March 1st, the patrol moved out from Company A's lines. The terrain was volcanic ridges and ravines, perfect for ambush. Japanese soldiers had established concealed positions throughout the area. Snipers, machine gun nests, mortar teams, all hidden in caves and spider holes. The patrol moved slowly. 20 yards. Stop, observe, listen. 20 more yards. The Marines knew Japanese defenders were watching. The question was when they would open fire. At 7:45 a.m., the patrol reached a ridge line overlooking a small valley. Stein moved to the front to get a better view of the terrain ahead. Through the volcanic rock formations, he could see what looked like camouflaged positions, possibly pillboxes, possibly cave entrances. The patrol needed to move closer to confirm. Stein signaled the patrol to advance. He stepped forward. M1 Garand at the ready. His feet, still bandaged from the barefoot runs 10 days earlier, ached with every step. The shrapnel wounds in his right arm and leg had not fully healed, but he moved forward. Because that was what he needed to do. A single shot rang out. The bullet struck Tony Stein in the head. He dropped instantly. The shot had come from a concealed position approximately 200 yards northeast, a spider hole or cave entrance. The patrol couldn't see the shooter. A corpsman reached Stein within seconds, but there was nothing they could do. The wound was fatal. Corporal Tony Stein, aged 23, died on the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima at 7:53 a.m. on March 1st, 1945. The patrol returned fire toward the suspected sniper position, called in mortar support. The area was saturated with high explosives. Whether the sniper died in the bombardment was never confirmed. Japanese soldiers rarely left bodies where Americans could find them. The patrol completed its mission. They identified the pillbox complex and returned to Company A with the intelligence. but they carried Tony Stein's body back with them. News of Stein's death spread quickly through the 28th Marines. The barefoot corporal who'd made 8 trips to the beach on February 19th, the Marine who'd refused evacuation after being wounded, the toolmaker from Dayton who'd built a weapon from salvaged aircraft parts and used it to destroy more enemy positions than anyone could count. On March 2nd, Stein was buried in the 5th Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima. A simple wooden cross marked his grave, his service number, his rank, his unit. No mention of the Stinger, no mention of the Medal of Honor that would later bear his name. The battle for Iwo Jima continued for 24 more days after Stein's death. The fighting remained brutal. The 28th Marines pushed north, clearing cave complexes and fortified positions. American casualties mounted. By March 26th, when the island was finally declared secure, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead, 20,000 wounded. Japanese casualties were worse. Of the 21,000 defenders, fewer than 1,000 survived. The rest died in their positions or committed suicide rather than surrender. The tunnel systems beneath Iwo Jima became mass graves. But on February 19th, during those first 8 hours of combat, Tony Stein and his improvised weapon had made a difference. His barefoot runs saved 9 wounded Marines who would have died on the beach. His suppressive fire allowed Company A to advance when other units were pinned down. His mechanical ingenuity had given the Marine Corps a weapon that for one day changed the tactical equation. The 5 other Stingers built by Mel Grevich's team also saw combat on Iwo Jima. 2 were destroyed by enemy fire. 1 jammed permanently from overheating. The other 2 survived the battle, but were lost in the chaos of equipment disposal after the war. None of the original 6 Stingers exist today. They were field modifications, non-standard equipment, the kind of weapons the military typically destroys rather than preserves. But the legend lived on in Marine Corps history. Armorers and mechanics heard the story. The toolmaker from Ohio who salvaged aircraft machine guns and turned them into infantry weapons, who ran barefoot through volcanic ash to keep his platoon supplied, who refused evacuation when wounded, who returned to combat when he should have been on a hospital ship. In May 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson submitted a recommendation for Tony Stein to receive the Medal of Honor. The recommendation detailed Stein's actions on February 19th, the 8 trips to the beach, the wounded Marines evacuated, the enemy positions were destroyed, the barefoot runs under fire. The recommendation was endorsed by every officer in the chain of command: Regiment, Division, Fleet Marine Force, Pacific Command. Everyone who reviewed the after-action reports agreed. Corporal Tony Stein had demonstrated conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. On February 19th, 1946, exactly 1 year after Stein's actions on Iwo Jima, his widow Joan received his Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the Ohio State House. Ohio Governor Frank Lauscher presented the medal. Joan Stein stood in his office, overwhelmed by the weight of the decoration and the memories it represented. Tony's mother, Rose, attended the ceremony. Tears streamed down her face. Her son, the Jewish immigrant's child who had dropped out of high school to work as a toolmaker, had received the nation's highest military honor. The Medal of Honor citation read, in part, "The first man of his unit to be on station after hitting the beach in the initial assault, Corporal Stein, armed with a personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, provided rapid covering fire as the remainder of his platoon attempted to move into position. When his comrades were stalled by a concentrated machine gun and mortar barrage, he gallantly stood upright and exposed himself to the enemy's view, thereby drawing the hostile fire to his own person and enabling him to observe the location of the furiously blazing hostile guns. Determined to neutralize the strategically placed weapons, he boldly charged the enemy pillboxes one by one and succeeded in killing 20 of the enemy during the furious single-handed assault. The citation continued for 3 more paragraphs, detailing each of his 8 trips to the beach, the wounded Marines he evacuated, and his refusal to seek medical treatment despite his wounds. It mentioned the personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, but it did not use the name Stinger. That name existed only in Marine Corps oral history. Tony Stein's remains stayed on Iwo Jima until December 1948. That month, his body was returned to Dayton for burial with full military honors. The ceremony at Our Lady of the Rosary Church drew hundreds of mourners, veterans, family, civilians who had never met him but understood what he represented. He was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Dayton, the only Medal of Honor recipient from that city in World War II. His grave marker lists his rank, his unit, and the decoration he earned. Visitors still leave coins and small American flags at the site. In 1972, the United States Navy commissioned USS Stein, a Knox-class frigate, in his honor. The ship served for 21 years, participating in operations in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It was decommissioned in 1993 and eventually scrapped, but the name Tony Stein lived on in naval records. The Marine Corps preserved his story in training materials and historical accounts. At Paris Island, the recruit depot where new Marines begin their service, instructors teach about improvisation and adaptation in combat. Tony Stein's story is part of that curriculum: the toolmaker who built a weapon from salvaged aircraft parts, the Marine who ran barefoot through volcanic ash to save his brothers. The Stinger became a legend in military firearms history. Ian McCollum of Forgotten Weapons documented the weapon's design and history. The Canadian Historical Arms Museum built a functional replica for educational purposes. That replica demonstrated what Stein and Grevich had accomplished with basic tools and mechanical knowledge. They had taken an aircraft machine gun designed for 300-mile-per-hour airstreams and adapted it for ground combat. They had solved the Marine Corps' firepower problem with salvaged parts and ingenuity. Military historians debate whether the Stinger was tactically significant. 6 weapons across 1 regiment, limited impact on the overall battle, but those 6 weapons made a difference to the Marines who fought alongside them. The suppressive fire allowed advances that would otherwise have stalled. The psychological impact of 1,200 rounds per minute kept enemy heads down at critical moments. What is not debatable is Tony Stein's courage. 8 trips under fire, 9 wounded Marines evacuated, barefoot runs through volcanic ash, refusing evacuation when wounded, returning from a hospital ship to rejoin his unit, leading a patrol that cost him his life. The barefoot corporal from Dayton represents something fundamental about the Marine Corps ethos: improvise, adapt, overcome. When standard equipment fails, build something better. When wounded, keep fighting. When ordered to rest, return to your unit. When faced with impossible odds, move forward. Tony Stein was 23 years old when he died. He had been a Marine for 2 years and 5 months. He fought on 2 islands. He killed more enemy soldiers than official records could count. He saved 8 lives in a single day, 1 for every trip he made across that exposed beach under fire, and he did it all with a weapon he helped build in a maintenance shed in Hawaii. Stein didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought about ammunition counts, casualty evacuation rates, suppression fire angles, the mathematics of survival. His platoon needed fire support. The Stinger provided it. Wounded men needed evacuation. He carried them. The fastest way to move was barefoot, so he removed his boots. Everything else was noise. Stories like Tony Stein's remind us why that generation earned the title Tom Brokaw gave them. Not because they sought glory, but because when their country needed them, they did what needed doing. They didn't ask for much in return, just that we remember, that we tell their stories, that we don't let them disappear into silence. So when you think about Iwo Jima, Don't just think about the flag on Suribachi. Think about the barefoot corporal running through volcanic ash. Think about the toolmaker who built a weapon because the standard issue wasn't good enough. Think about the man who refused to leave his brothers behind. Think about Tony Stein, because that's what he would have wanted. Not monuments or glory, just for us to remember what happened on that beach. And why it mattered? He was 23 years old. He should have had a lifetime ahead of him. Instead, he gave that lifetime away, one barefoot run at a time, so others could go home. That's the mathematics of courage. That's the legacy of Tony Stein. And that's a story we must never forget. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the price of freedom and the courage of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, please subscribe to this channel. We rescue forgotten stories from history's archives every week, stories of heroes who deserve to be remembered. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and help us make sure these men and women are never forgotten. Because remembering is the least we can do.